In 1995, an announcement quietly echoed through the American business world. Zenith Electronics, once one of the most respected names in consumer electronics, had filed for bankruptcy. There were no dramatic headlines dominating the front pages for long, no nationwide mourning. But inside countless American homes, something intangible had already been lost. Zenith wasn't just a company, it was a symbol. For decades, the Zenith S logo had represented reliability, durability, and a certain kind of American promise, the belief that products built with care by skilled hands could last for generations. And yet, by the mid-1990s, that promise had begun to fade. Factories in Chicago that once buzzed with activity fell silent. Assembly lines that had produced millions of televisions slowed, then stopped. Workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers at Zenith, found themselves without a place in an industry they had helped build. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to a very different time, a time when Zenith didn't just compete in the living room, it defined it. The commander's dream. At the center of Zenith's rise was a man whose personality shaped the company's identity, Eugene F. McDonald Jr. Known as the Commander, McDonald was not a typical corporate executive. A former naval officer, he brought discipline, conviction, and a strong sense of purpose into the business world. For him, electronics were not just products, they were tools that should serve people. One of his most famous beliefs was simple: technology should adapt to the user, not the other way around. This philosophy guided Zenith from its early days as a radio manufacturer into a dominant force in television. McDonald believed deeply in American manufacturing and insisted that Zenith products be made domestically, primarily in Chicago. Under his leadership, the company embraced a principle that would become legendary: quality goes in before the name goes on. This was not a marketing slogan, it was a strict internal standard. Every component, every connection, every design decision had to meet a level of quality that justified carrying the Zenith name. McDonald understood that trust, once broken, could not easily be repaired, so he built a company that aimed never to break it. By the 1950s, Zenith televisions were becoming fixtures in American homes. Families gathered around them in the evenings, watching news broadcasts, variety shows, and early sitcoms. The television was not just entertainment, it was becoming the center of domestic life. And Zenith was at the center of that transformation. Built to last. During its golden years, Zenith distinguished itself not just through innovation, but through craftsmanship. Unlike many competitors, Zenith resisted the shift toward mass-produced electronic assembly methods. While others began adopting printed circuit boards, Zenith continued to rely heavily on hand wiring. To the company, this wasn't inefficiency, it was superiority. Hand-wired connections allowed technicians to ensure each unit met exacting standards. Workers on the assembly line were not treated as interchangeable laborers. Many were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. In practical terms, this meant Zenith televisions often lasted longer than competing products. There are countless stories from American households that reflect this reputation. One commonly repeated anecdote involves families who purchased a Zenith television in the 1960s and continued using it well into the 1980s without major repairs. In an era before disposable electronics, this kind of reliability built deep brand loyalty. For many middle-class families, buying a Zenith television was an investment. It was something you expected to keep for years, perhaps even decades. This durability reinforced the company's image as a cornerstone of American quality. But beneath this success, a quiet shift was beginning. one that Zenith would struggle to adapt to. Changing the way we watch. Zenith was not just about durability. It was also responsible for one of the most transformative innovations in the history of television, the remote control. In the 1950s, changing channels required getting up and manually adjusting the television. It was a small inconvenience, but one that defined the viewing experience. Zenith sought to eliminate that inconvenience. The first step was the Flashmatic, an early wireless remote that used light beams to control the television. While innovative, it had limitations, including interference from ambient light. Zenith quickly improved upon this concept with the Space Command remote. Unlike its predecessor, the Space Command used ultrasonic sound signals, producing the distinctive clicking noise that became instantly recognizable. Each button generated a different frequency, allowing users to change channels or adjust volume without leaving their seats. This innovation fundamentally changed how people interacted with media. The act of watching television became more passive, more comfortable, and more personal. Control shifted from the device to the viewer. Today, the remote control is taken for granted, but at the time, it represented a major leap forward, and Zenith was at the forefront. It was a moment when the company's philosophy aligned perfectly with technological progress, but innovation alone would not be enough to secure its future. The color wars. As television technology advanced, the next major battleground emerged: color broadcasting. The transition from black and white to color television was not just a technical challenge, it was a commercial and political one. Competing companies and regulatory bodies debated standards, compatibility, and timing. Zenith became deeply involved in this struggle. While companies like RCA pushed aggressively for their color systems, Zenith took a more cautious approach. The company emphasized compatibility with existing black and white broadcasts and sought to ensure that consumers would not be forced to abandon their current sets prematurely. This approach reflected Zenith's commitment to the customer, but it also slowed its ability to compete in a rapidly evolving market. The color wars were not just about technology, they were about speed, influence, and strategic positioning. And in these areas, Zenith began to fall behind. The rising challenge. By the 1970s and 1980s, a new wave of competitors entered the global market. Companies like Sony and Panasonic introduced televisions that were not only technologically advanced, but also significantly more affordable. Their approach to manufacturing was fundamentally different. Instead of relying on labor-intensive hand wiring, these companies embraced automation in printed circuit boards. This allowed them to produce electronics faster, more consistently, and at lower cost. At first, Zenith underestimated this shift. The company believed that its superior build quality would continue to justify higher prices, but consumers were beginning to think differently. Affordability, convenience, and modern design were becoming just as important as durability. As Japanese imports flooded the American market, Zenith found itself under increasing pressure. The competition was no longer local, it was global. A philosophy under pressure. Inside Zenith's Chicago headquarters, a difficult question began to emerge. Should the company adapt or stay true to its principles? The hand-wired philosophy that had once been a strength was now becoming a liability. Production costs were rising, while competitors continued to reduce theirs. Executives faced a dilemma that went beyond economics. Abandoning hand wiring meant abandoning a core part of the company's identity. It meant admitting that the very practices that had built Zenith's reputation were no longer sustainable. But maintaining those practices meant falling further behind. This tension defined Zenith's internal struggles during this period. The company did eventually begin to adopt more modern manufacturing techniques, but by then it was already trailing competitors who had embraced these changes years earlier. Zenith was no longer setting the pace, it was trying to catch up. The cracks appeared. By the 1980s, the consequences of these decisions became increasingly visible. Zenith's market share declined steadily. Financial losses mounted. The company struggled to compete on price without sacrificing its already pressured margins. Layoffs became more frequent. For workers in Chicago, this was more than a business downturn. It was a personal crisis. Many had spent decades building televisions that symbolized American excellence. Now, they were watching that legacy unravel. The broader context made the situation even more complex. Globalization was reshaping entire industries. Manufacturing jobs were moving overseas. Companies that could not adapt quickly enough found themselves at a disadvantage. Zenith was one of them. Despite its struggles, Zenith continued to innovate. The company played a significant role in the development of high-definition television, HDTV, contributing important technologies that would shape the future of broadcasting. This was a reminder of what Zenith had always been capable of. But innovation alone could not offset years of financial strain. In 1995, the company was acquired by LG Electronics. For Zenith, this marked the end of its identity as an independent American manufacturer. The brand would continue to exist, but under different ownership, in a different context. The Chicago era was effectively over. The silent legacy. Today, Zenith is no longer a dominant force in the living room, but its legacy remains. The company helped define what consumers expect from electronics: reliability, usability, and innovation. It introduced technologies that are still part of everyday life, and it represents a broader story about American industry. Zenith's rise reflects a time when manufacturing was closely tied to national identity and economic stability. Its fall highlights the challenges of adapting to a rapidly changing global market. Perhaps the most endearing image is a simple one: an old Zenith television, still functioning decades after it was built, sitting quietly in a corner of a room. It no longer represents the future, but it still tells a story of ambition, craftsmanship, and the difficult choices that define every great company's journey.